We acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the Indigenous people on whose lands Syracuse University now stands. May the information you glean from this podcast motivate you to uphold Indigenous values, protect Mother Earth, and honor Indigenous treaties. The Doctrine of Christian Discovery started in the Catholic Church. Its ramifications, most popularly known in American government framework. But we should stop and ask ourselves, wasn't colonization across the entire Americas? Where did it also leave its stain? Welcome to the Doctrine of Christian Discovery. I'm Tanner Randall, your host from Good Faith Media. We're producing this podcast at the Religious Origins of White Supremacy Conference in December of 2023 at Syracuse University in New York. This year is particularly special because it's the 100th anniversary of Johnson v. McIntosh, the Supreme Court proceeding that installed the framework of the Doctrine of Discovery within American government. We will be talking about the different ramifications of the Doctrine of Discovery and how it led to Indigenous values and land being stolen, as well as white supremacy and the general idea of revitalized Indigenous culture. The Doctrine of Christian Discovery, originating from the Vatican, spread and infected every continent. Today, we'll be talking specifically about the Americas, focusing on Latin America and South America. Brazil, for example, colonized by the Portuguese, still has lingering effects from the colonization that took place years ago. We'll also talk about how Christian nationalism has infected a lot of the countries around Latin America and South America and caused extremism in different government frameworks. But why do we feel like this is still okay? Why do people still buy into these religions? Well, look no further than the Doctrine of Christian Discovery. We would like to thank our sponsors who made this podcast possible. Many thanks to the Henry Luce Foundation, Syracuse University, Indigenous Values Initiative, American Indian Law Alliance, American Indian Community House, Good Faith Media, Tanatierra, and Towards Our Common Public Life. We appreciate your support. I'm Tanner Randall with Good Faith Media. Our guest on this episode is Dr. João Chaves. João is a professor of religion at Baylor University in Texas. His focus is in the religion and the history of religion in the Americas, the influence of U.S. Protestantism in Latin America, and the development of Latin America and Latinx religious networks in the United States. Dr. Chaves also has a particular interest in Brazilian government framework, and that will be a major topic of discussion today. Hi, I'm here with João Chaves, and we are talking about the history and implications of the Doctrine of Christian Discovery, specifically in the Americas, with a particular focus in Latin America and South America. To get started, this week at our conference, we are discussing the 200th anniversary of Johnson v. McIntosh, the document that emplaced the Doctrine of Discovery's principles within the United States framework. But I'd like to pivot in our conversation and subject area of this conference to something specifically related to South America or Latin America. Could you provide an example of the Doctrine of Christian Discovery's influence in these areas, and if it's in a government framework within the many countries in that region?
Yeah, of course. The Doctrine of Discovery, in terms of the Papal Bull, dealt directly with the Portuguese and Spanish. There's direct influence in my own country of Brazil, which has roughly half the area and half the population of South America. It's indigenous peoples in Brazil are still fighting issues related to the presumption of appropriation. that came with the Portuguese and continued on in many different governments. As a matter of fact, one very recent example that happened in Brazil, but you can see some strong connections to that kind of dispositions, is the controversy on what in Brazil became known as the legislation called Marco Temporal, or temporal marker, in which some more conservative groups in government wanted to say that whichever indigenous land that had not been demarcated before the Constitution of Brazil was promulgated, it could no longer be demarcated for indigenous peoples, which was understood by indigenous communities there as a pretext for further land appropriation. Ultimately, the legislation was not implemented. It did not pass the Supreme Court, but it represents the kind of spirit that has been historically present in the history of Brazil, and it continues in different ways, especially in terms of more contemporary Brazilian history, in the Bolsonaro administration and what that have represented. But it has been more deeply than that, a continuing legacy of Brazil since the Portuguese government or the Portuguese Empire was there. As a matter of fact, Brazil is the one colony that housed the empire when the whole court from Portugal, fleeing from Napoleon, went to Brazil and established itself there. So you have even a very strong accents of that particular disposition and presumption of ownership of those lands.
It's interesting that you say you said that even though that Marco Temporal was not implemented, I think it's important to realize that the spirit is still there, like you mentioned, and just having that image on a national level is so destructive to indigenous peoples, because it puts out the framework that, you know, it may have not worked now, but it's something they're trying to achieve. So they may still keep trying to chip away at those indigenous rights. And so I'm curious to kind of ask you about what's the atmosphere around that issue? Are there improvements, or they're still trying to encroach on indigenous land?
Oh, most certainly. Most certainly. And there are many market forces that also push those kinds of moves. In the Amazon, it might be deforestation for land for cattle growing, for example. It might be other ways of land appropriation that happen in the Amazon. I mean, there are many different forces moving in the direction. And again, this is not new. It is a struggle the indigenous people in Brazil have had for a long, long time. As a matter of fact, I was just in the Amazon in May, and I had a few conversations with religious leaders in a new project that I'm working on. And you can see how that kind of encroachment happens, although it is complexified because evangelical Christians in Brazil have done an effective job at recruiting some indigenous leaders to do part of that very work.
Okay.
So it is complex. It is not a black and white issue, but it is an issue and a mentality that is disseminated via different avenues, including some indigenous Brazilians that have, or at least perform, a certain disposition that is similar to those of again, Brazilian evangelicals and other forms of conservative Christianities. Their recruitment and employed in different ways. Of course, it's difficult always to make judgments about where or to what extent we should account for local agency. Especially if you're not part of particular ethnocultural groups. But it's definitely a complex issue that continues to move on and includes also conservative-leaning native Brazilians and other forces. So it's not Autobot versus Decepticon, good versus evil, very clearly shown.
Exactly.
As one would like to. To be, but it is more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm. I think that it's always challenging for me to come to terms with the fact of like these evangelicalism converting indigenous peoples to Christianity and how that kind of can lead to the promotion of the doctrine of discovery. And so I'm kind of curious to hear your opinion on how it's sometimes radicalized, or even on a more nuanced level, how evangelicalism has affected particularly Brazil in promoting the doctrine of discovery. Because I know in the United States that we had the assimilation school system, and I know some people will call them genocide schools because there was so much cultural damage in the implementation of Christianity. And it almost led to kind of the acceptance of some of the things we see happening in American Indian population. So if you could speak to that, I would appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, let me step back a little bit and talk about the form of evangelicalism that I think manifests the most clear disposition of domination. And it is the sort of conservative Southern evangelicalism that went to Brazil in its sustainable phase and more explicitly with Confederate exiles who, upon losing the war here in the United States in 1865, fled to different places where they could imagine would allow them to reconstruct the Old South. Brazil was one of those places, was the most prominent one. Thousands of families, Southern families, went to Brazil because Brazil remained a slave-holding country for 23 years after the end of the Civil War. Was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yes,
very enlightening.
And it is in these Confederate enclaves that we have Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist churches. Starting, it is the place that that receives many pioneer missionaries that go from there into their evangelistic crusades in different parts of Brazil, and including the Amazon and other different places. That genealogy continues today. Those denominations, they build seminaries. And they translate literature. They control mostly American missionaries. Even when Brazilian legislation did not allow them to do that, they found ways to control publications. And you can see that transnational connection between U.S. forms of evangelicalism and Brazil going on throughout over a century, and it continues today. During the dictatorship under which I was born, is a right-wing dictatorship that was U.S. supported. You see a leadership, a government that wants to suppress progressive forms of Catholicism, particularly liberation theologies. And part of that suppression included giving structural benefits to evangelicals who they saw as better transmitters of the kind of religious ideology that would help authoritarian governments thrive. It is then that Assemblies of God leaders and Baptist leaders, among others, get concessions to have radio and television shows, and gain other forms of governmental support. It is also that coincides with increased urbanization that accounts for the explosive growth of Protestantism in Brazil. Even when I was growing in Brazil, I would not believe if someone would tell me that by 2030 or 2033, Brazil was going to become a majority evangelical country, but we are on track to do that. And part of that story is also the kind of support that Protestant got from dictators during those times. And you see over and over again the kind of message of Christian superiority that is not interested in ecumenical or interfaith conversations, is not interested in being welcoming to practitioners of Afro-Brazilian religions or indigenous ways of being, and as a matter of fact, are the kinds of evangelicalism that support the very socially conservative dispositions that you see here. And one example, very recent, again, to go back to recent developments in Brazil, is the fact that Steve Bannon, who was a campaign manager and advisor for Donald Trump, was also an advisor of the Bolsonaros. And then you see insurrections going on here and insurrections going on there. You see denial of elections that do not go their way happening here, and you see those denials happening there. So the kind of U.S.-Brazil relationship, especially in terms of Christian conservative networks, is a story with a long genealogy and continues today and continues to strengthen today. I'll just tell you one more story and I'll stop. When I was there in May, one of the persons we interviewed was the leader of the evangelical caucus in the Brazilian congressman. And during that conversation, he mentioned that he had a meeting with the folks from Capital Ministries, that also work here in Washington, D.C., strengthening networks of theopolitical conservatisms of different ways, and they always also support those networks there. So I'm not sure if that addresses your concern directly, but I do want to highlight that these transnational conservative connections have a long history, and they continue to strengthen, and they continue to organize. They are extremely well organized and are already organizing, in the Brazilian case, a comeback to the presidency, given that Bolsonaro did not win his bid for re-election.
It's interesting because I did not know about the kind of way the United States politics reflects Brazil's, and I think that we could learn a lot from dissecting both environments. It brings me to a question of, and this is going to be a little bit of a two-part question. First is, you said that Brazil is on track to be a majority of evangelicals, correct, by 2030. So how did the Christian religion spread so fast, and was there an atmosphere ripe for people wanting some sort of institutionalized religion? What is that kind of like? Because I know with indigenous peoples, you'll hear some of the converts say, we knew there was a great spirit out there, and Christianity contextualized our belief. And so they found great comfort in that. So tell me a little bit about that environment, and I'll wait for my next question after this answer.
Oh, that there are many answers to that question. I will say a couple of things. One thing is that in the case of Brazil, which was a predominantly Catholic country, it was not as much what happened was not necessarily as much a move from non-organized religion to organized religion, but rather from one organized religion to another. Part of that of those that change, that shift, has been articulated as the crisis in the Catholic priesthood, for example. There is not enough leadership. Protestantism historically has capitalized on urbanization. Brazil urbanizes very fast. But then another point that sociologists and scholars of Brazilian religion have pointed out is how the translatability of Pentecostalism works productively when it enters into conversation with Afro-Brazilian religions. The growing edge of Christianity in Brazil today is Pentecostalism, and within Brazilian Pentecostalism, there is a very large a very large number of Afro-Brazilians who join that group, to the extent that, as problematic as this saying might be, some Brazilian scholars would say that the blackest religion in Brazil is actually Pentecostalism, rather than the Afro-Brazilian religions that still remain a very important part of Brazilian life and culture. Folks who study conversion, they often talk about conversion as something that happens when there is a particular crisis of opportunity in the group that changes affiliation, right, or changes ideology, the kind of solutions that the group entering or offering a new ideology has for the crisis, or how that group can optimize those opportunities, and then the context in which that happens, right? So when there is cultural alignment with a particular kind of ideology that is offered, the probability of conversion, of change of affiliation happens. And I think that in the case of Brazil, urbanization, the crisis in the priesthood from the Catholic Church, the vernacular way in which Pentecostalism develops, that adapts itself very quickly to different different situations, certainly account for some of that shift, because Protestantism in Brazil in its different versions grew so fast that is not just natality rate, is not just birth rate, although that is a very good predictor of religious growth. There is a lot of conversion from Catholicism or from Afro-Brazilian religions to Protestant streams also.
Interesting, because it's always different from country to country why a religion takes hold, and I think that it's really important to recognize, whether it be a community that is disadvantaged, being susceptible for, organizational help and leadership and getting brought into religion, or if it's not as far as a transition as people think, like you're saying. In Brazil, it was more of a Catholic church to Protestantism, which is rather natural. Or not natural, that's not the correct word, but is an intuitive change that somebody could make. And so I think that looking at, whatever conversion it may be, in whatever religion it may be converted to, and a lot of the times, and what we're talking about in this conference is how that results in extremism and white nationalism and things of that sort. And so I guess this is leading into my last question here of, when you see religion of a person kind of bleeding into government structures, it's one thing to say my life and decisions are based off of my own religional preferences. It's another to project those into a system. So what kind of mechanisms should we identify and try to correct within governments like that of Brazil and other in South America, or not correct, but be critical of and be aware of in Brazil and other South American countries?
Yeah. Well, I think that what we have in Brazil today, in some ways, and in some ways in the US too, are different and competing narratives for the future of the nation, right? So different stories about our present and different imaginations of what the future can be based on our understanding of the present. Perhaps my historian disposition takes over when I talk about those myths, but I think they're important. And part of what I see happening in Brazil is precisely that. You see on these Protestant groups that are really important for some of these religious right networks. They tell a particular story about Brazil that mirrors some of the dispositions in terms of the doctrine of discovery, and they want Brazil to become some sort of a Christian country. Right, so when you see a big red flag is when you see a particular group of people wanting the values and the particular interpretation of social life that religion has, or that version of that religion have, then become the basis of the legislation for a whole nation. And we certainly see that in these conservative evangelical groups that are in coalition with conservative Catholic groups that want to have a particular view of what a family must look like, right? So what kind of marriages that we're then going to allow. Or they want to tell a particular story about the preeminence of the cultural superiority of Christianity and the Anglo-European structures that were implemented into the country. And if that is superior, then everything else is inferior, then, and which very much then informs how we're going to implement public education. We're having those battles about public education there too.
Yeah.
Right? And which then affect the next generation's imagination of where they are and where they can be. So that is really a project of dominations that overlap very significantly with the kind of things that happen in the U.S. Legislation based on particularly conservatively Christian dispositions that want to take the rights of minorities that do not fit a very narrow view of morality, and then want to put educational structures that support a very limited imagination that then reproduces that kind of bias and constraints that they defend. That is happening there. Also, because in terms of Brazil particularly, the racial imagination is significantly different than in the U.S. It is you often see broader ethno-racial representation defending those visions than you might see here.
Okay.
But the narrative is pretty similar, and I think that speaks to the continuous long-term connections between conservative networks between these two countries that have never really not been a reality since Brazil began, and especially in the 1940s when the United States really invest in making Brazil a pro-U.S. culture, right? In what historian Antônio Tota called the seduction of Brazil, which was funded to a great extent by Rockefeller money, by Baptist money.
Interesting.
Right? So, I mean, there are many connections there that could be teased out, but there is an intentionally maintained transnational project to the extent that somebody like Ben Cowan, historian at the University of California, calls the moral majority in his book, The Moral Majorities Across the Americas, the co-creation of the religious rights between Brazil and the U.S. That those countries co-create what we call the religious rights today, rather than the U.S. just creates it and imposes it. That Brazil is a very important part of the story, serving as one of the places that need to be understood so that we can understand what's happening here too, right? So we cannot understand the developments there without understanding what's happening here. But to a similar extent, is difficult to understand what's happening in the U.S. without paying attention to the role that Brazil has in this Pan-American connection that is long-lasting.
No, I think it's important to realize all of the countries within the Americas originate from strikingly similar situations. Most of the populations were colonized. Most of them were subjected to a rule they didn't consent to. And then that rule was subject to extremism and caused violence. So I think it is important to understand that all of these environments grew up in coexistence and influenced each other's behavior. And then once one had more money than the other, then they started flooding money to, keep those systems in place.
Right.
And so I think that it's interesting that, all these kind of colonized entities grew up to be or have biased tendencies within their populations. But one of the subtle aspects that you mentioned earlier that I thought was extremely interesting that I had never heard of before was the Confederate exiles to South America and the impact of that. And so I think that we should always be critical of kind of who is in an environment that can catalyze a lot of poor ideals. And so I think that's important to realize. But during the 20th century, we saw a lot of different fascist regimes. The most pertinent one would be the Nazi regime in Germany. And once that war ended, it almost seemed like we were going to champion a new environment of inclusiveness and try to create just governments. But then we start to see more of an appetite for oppressive strongman countries to go and force their own policies onto smaller entities. So could you speak to why you think that or if there is a larger appetite for fascism, and why would that be if there is?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, I cannot help to put my historian's hat and first mention that the democracy is a very early experiment. Right. It has not been the historical rule long term. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that the upheavals in the 60s are already a response to the aspirations that came after the war that remain unrealized, right? So you have the United Nations and the World Council of Churches come together in about the same time, in some ways demonstrating the aspirations of a more united world. But that united world remained not united against segregation in the U.S., against hunger in Latin America, against sexism everywhere, against homophobia everywhere, right? So the kind of aspirations that post-World War II, even articulated aspirations in the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, for example. You see those aspirations there. But those are not new aspirations. The American Constitution has unrealized aspirations. Like the French Revolution had their unrealized aspirations that talked about every person, and that is in some cases it speaks to the drafters of those documents' limited sense of who counts as human. In other ways, those are documents with aspirations that are hard to be implemented, right? So the disappointment with the articulated aspirations for new worlds is something that has different iterations, right? So in the 60s, when we have some, and 70s, when you get different levels of a little more equality for a few minoritized groups, we'll see that they didn't go as far as we want them to go, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then but as a result of that, as some of these spaces continue to diversify, I think that white supremacy in some ways reacts as a group becomes threatened by their diminishing role in culture and society, right? So in some ways, it seems to me that societies do not move forward linearly, but the disappointment with broad aspirations for a better world are something that you see happening over and over again. And it seems to me that despite our defense of democratic institutions, it did not, of some people's hope for capitalism and some people's hope for different kinds of broadly disseminated structures in our societies. Those structures did not deliver. did not deliver their aspirations. And as we continue to think about different versions of what the world could be, there is a let's go back to we're great again. When were we great, man? You know, I mean, let's go. In Brazil, I mean, some of that happened. Bolsonaro, again, to mention him again, praises dictators. And we'd had order then, right? We had good public education then. Right, so it was great for some people, maybe,
dangerous lingo,
but not others. And even then, there is an illusion that those times were great. I mean, poor whites struggle throughout, even when eluding themselves, thinking that they're superior than other non-white groups that happen here and happen in Brazil and in different places. So. Perhaps my pessimism is showing, but it seems to me that these kinds of social political struggles are a part of our reality, and they might change in accent, and they might change in particular goals. But despite the hope of having a world in which they won't exist. I don't think we'll get that.
I know it's difficult for me because I look at these large issues and I get so frustrated by the human lifespan because you can't do or fix all of these issues within one generation. It's so frustrating because results would be really nice. So during my time in college, the attitude amongst my peers was a thirst for reconciling some of the mistakes of our past. But I think one of the valuable insights you may be able to provide teaching at a large institution and seeing a diverse amount of students coming from different backgrounds, I was wondering if you could speak towards the hope or possible initiative that young kids may be taking to fix some of these issues, or do you see more of that nostalgia factor that you've mentioned of taking our societal concepts back a step to reflect that of our generations prior?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I'll mention a couple of things, then I'll see if I address it. I mean, I like that American poet Wendell Berry, he says in one of his poems, Mad Farmers Liberation Front, I think. Like that, he says, "Be joyful, though you've considered all the facts." Or reminds me of Cornel West, who says that he's not an optimist, but he's hopeful. Right? So let me tell you a story that just happened, and then I'll try to give a more conceptual answer. I was teaching I'm teaching 120 undergrads this semester, 2 classes of 60, roughly. In one of those sessions, before we went into the break, and it's a diverse, group of students, not as diverse as I would like them to be in my particular setting, but nevertheless. I told them, so for those of you who celebrate Thanksgiving, I hope you have a good season. But if you are Native American, and then as I was about to say something, a student yelled, no, I said, if you are Native American, I wish you have. And I was going to speak, somebody yelled, freedom! Right? I was like, positively surprised by that. That there is a sense that there is something deeply wrong in the way in which we live our life, in the way in which we normalized, right? In that same class, I had talked to them about Walter. It's a question on the Christian heritage, and I talked about Walter Rauschenbusch, who says that a social gospel movement, and he says that a good system a bad system make good people do bad things. But a good system make bad people do good things. Right, and I talk to the students. All of them think they're good, but they're all supporting sweatshops somewhere, right? So the kind of systems that we live, and this is a kind of unpack with them. The kind of systems in which we live make even folks like you or me, who might think of ourselves as being good, performing bad acts just to live our daily lives, because it's so deep, it's so deeply ingrained in some of the evils of our system, and so globally connected and interdependent that that is difficult to not be bad with it. Either consciously or not, and they are different kind of. There's a spectrum there, right? But I think the point was well taken, and we had many discussions with the students about the little that can be done. So I am hopeful in the sense that there seems to be, in the generation that I am in conversation with anyway, a sense that there is something deeply wrong with the world, a will to change it, and a curiosity about the mechanisms that could be productive in executing change. What I am not sure exists is the kind of sustained commitment and awareness that the journey is long and it is not an easy one. So what remains to be seen for me is in the going from the awareness of the issues and the will to change, what kind of action can be taken and will be taken. That question is a complicated one, I think, because we are often entangled in ways that are difficult to shake off, and without organization, without sustained commitment, without good leadership, without ability to form strong coalitions, without the willingness to speak to both sides of the issue, which in a world that it's increasingly polarized, we have less of. I think that the changing of the things that we can change become less likely. So, but I am hopeful. I'm just not optimistic.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Doctrine of Christian Discovery, recorded at the 2023 Religious Origins of White Supremacy Conference at Syracuse University in New York. This podcast is produced in collaboration between Good Faith Media, Syracuse University, and the Indigenous Values Initiative. I'm Tanner Randall for Good Faith Media. Our executive producers are Mitch Randall of Good Faith Media, Philip P. Arnold and Sandy Big Tree of the Indigenous Values Initiative, and Adam D.J. Brett of Syracuse University and the American Indian Law Alliance. Our producer is Cliff Vaughn. Our editor is David Peng. Our music comes from Pond 5. Production assistance provided by the American Indian Law Alliance. To learn more, go to doctrineofdiscovery.org.